So the topic of our video today is, will the Amish take over the world? Which is kind of tongue in cheek, but there is actually a lot of data that would suggest that they're at least going to be a much bigger part of the future. Um, Sounds a little ridiculous, but we're going to look at the demographic trends, and once you see these, you might think it's a little less ridiculous. So first thing that you have to realize is the world is approaching a demographic cliff. Um, it's going to cause a lot of major countries, the population inside those countries, to shrink dramatically. Japan is always cited as being one of the first that has kind of started to hit that cliff and fall off that cliff. They have I was just reading an interesting article on that recently that, often some of these rural villages, there are gangs of grandmas with guns that have to hunt the monkeys because the monkeys are taking back over the rural areas, and they've made these creepy looking wolves, fake wolves that are to chase off the bears because bears are coming back in. Nature's just kind of taking back over because there are fewer and fewer Japanese people. They lose about, I think it's 500,000 people a year. So it's just going to continue down that road. And basically, the issue is we don't have enough children. So we live much longer. So you do get kind of a little bit of play at that end that more people are going to be around longer and longer. But the birth rate is 1 point something in most countries. You need 2.2, some say 2.1 children to have a replacement rate. Whereas in a place like Japan, it's going to be like 1.1, 1.2. Or in the United States, we're actually doing a bit better and we'll be like 1.8 or so. Depends on the year and the country, but for the most part, developed nations are 1.5 children per woman. Um, and like I said, the United States is right there with them. And most of our religions and races and groups are also under replacement, except with notable exceptions, including the Amish. And the Amish aren't just okay, well, you need 2.2, and the Amish, they have 2.8, so they're going to be growing. They're among the fastest growing um, identifiable groups in the world. Joseph Donnermeyer, who's in Ohio State University over near one of the major centers of the Amish, which is Holmes County, Ohio, he did a detailed study looking at them. He found the Amish were doubling about every 21 to 22 years. And by 2050, they're going to have over 1 million people. So they're starting with kind of low numbers, but you can only double so many times before it starts to become very noticeable. And that's kind of what happened in Israel with the Orthodox, they call them, the Hasidic and Herod. Their word for it is the Haredim, um, but there are various Orthodox groups like the Hasids, Hasidic people, and they started being 3-4% in the public schools. And then there's a book about this that's pretty interesting. Um, I believe his name is Joseph Kaufman, Eric Kaufman. His name is Eric Kaufman. He wrote a book, Will the Religious Inherit the Earth? And this is kind of along the same lines as what he was saying, which is birth rates and retention and all of this it led the Orthodox Jews to now be trending very soon will be a majority of the Jewish population, and they started from a pretty small group, and likewise the Amish have a similar trajectory of just of growth. So coming from a population of maybe a couple thousand people at the turn of the 20th century, it's really jaw dropping for them to be reaching 1 million pretty soon. So we can look at those numbers a little bit more, but just in terms of who the Amish are, they're a group of mostly Swiss heritage, from Switzerland, and they speak a Swiss German that was from, the 17th century. Um, and they were already pretty traditional type people for 17th century people. So, it's sort of old fashioned even for that era. And they are, so they speak that, they call it Dutch or Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's Swiss German from the 1700s or 17th century. And they, the Amish they're sometimes called Amish Mennonites. That's kind of their full name. And they split off from the rest of the Mennonites in 1693 when a Mennonite named Jacob Ammon, where you get the word Amish, he thought that the Mennonites were getting a little too lenient, too lax, and they weren't implementing the rules well enough. So he split off, and the Amish Mennonites, or we just call them Amish, came off of that. So very end of the 1600s, 1693. And then right in the early 1700s, only a few years later, they were already immigrating to the United States. And so there aren't any left in Europe. So the Amish that are still around to this day are all here. And so from the 1700s, on, they've been sort of quietly just existing in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, just not many of them. And they were just a handful of very religious Anabaptists, so German-speaking Protestants that were just living their lives. And I don't think they really made too big a splash because there were a lot of other very religious farmers who spoke Pennsylvania Dutch also that weren't Amish. So they were just slightly more traditional Pennsylvania Dutch farmers. And initially they would have had just a few hundred people. It's not even very well documented because they were pretty simple people and they didn't really leave records of how exactly many there were. But by 1920, they had grown from that few hundred to now 5,000 people. So that's 1920, 5,000. And we're talking about them getting to 1 million in a couple more decades. So they've been, from a pretty small group of people that would probably have all known each other, a lot of them, few communities, couple communities. Now they just rapidly expanded, and they're continuing to. So I think people in the United States became aware of them more in the last 100 years. Just started just seeing them grow because there sort of became a novelty. These odd farmers in Pennsylvania and the Midwest who just they have old-timey clothes and they speak that archaic German and they ride around on horse and buggies and they don't even use electricity. So they're sort of just seen as odd and almost a joke. But now suddenly a lot more people are taking notice because there are just so many more Amish people around right now than there were. The Young Center, which is part of Elizabethtown College in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So the Young Center is out of that college in Lancaster, and I spoke with two of their professors that are out of there, David Weaver Zurcher and Stephen Nault, and they agreed with what Donnermeyer at Ohio State said about it doubling every 20 years. So that's what their Young Center does a lot of the research on the Amish. They're kind of the main people that you go to for information on that, and they say every 20 years they're doubling. So you can see a chart. This is from the Young Center, and it shows just how quickly they're expanding. Predicting the future can be a complicated matter, of course. So, especially with something as complicated as especially with something with as many variables as demographics, where there's so many factors going into that. But if the trend continues of them doubling, it would take about 200 years for them to surpass the current population of the United States. So Lyman Stone, who's a popular demographer, he writes a lot for various websites, both on the left, like Vox, and on the right, like the Federalist. He's well known as a legitimate demographer, and he also works for the Demographic Intelligence Project. He said that yeah, that's who came up with the 200 years. So his estimation is by that point there would be a majority of Amish people. And so looking at the growth curve, here's a quote from him. He says, "And that, folks, is an exponential growth curve. You don't see one of them suckers in the demographic wild every day. And when you do, it's usually some kind of new settlement of virgin country or something, or a developing country with few mass catastrophic events." So, he was basically saying this is something you don't see very often in modern day, just that kind of a growth curve. Um, the boom will probably not be noticed, by your average American for a little while, but when it is noticed, when it does reach the point where they're really a good chunk of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, and they're spreading into these other states rapidly, I think it will be something that will really take people by surprise, and it's going to change America dramatically and permanently. I say permanently because these are not people that change with the whims of the culture. So if they grow to this extent, there's going to be a solid group of people that is just Amish. They're not, um, as you'll see, they don't really have a huge group leaving. They don't have huge splits where all of a sudden all these people, they've had some, like there's the beachy Amish and there's the New Order Amish that are a little more liberal, you could say. But for the most part, it's they're holding to traditions that they've had since the 1600s, and they're not really going to just frivolously, oh well, this new trend's happening. So it's kind of going to hit, like I said, permanently in the sense that there are going to be Amish communities that are just going to exist after this point. So first, this change you'll see it in, I'll call them the big three, which are Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Those are the three states that have about 75% of Amish people live in those three states. But it's also now spilling into neighboring states, and those states are going to um, start to be really surprised by this as well. So while the Amish are beginning to take up more and more of those traditional three states, they are also moving into the next frontiers for them, which is Wisconsin, New York, Michigan, Missouri, and Kentucky. Each of those states, they border one of the big three, except for if you pretend Illinois doesn't exist, because they seem to have just hopped over Illinois. But they kind of border those other states where they traditionally have lived. All of these now have 5-digit Amish populations, and Iowa is close behind. They have 9,980. So by the time you see this, they'll probably also be in the 5 digits. And a lot of these had very small Amish populations, like one settlement, kind of thing. And then, so in 1992, there were 53 districts in Wisconsin. A district is sort of a little community of 130 people ish. And if it gets too much bigger than that, they split. They have a kind of a process for that. So there were 53 of these little communities in 1992 in Wisconsin, and that was a little less than 7,000 people, is according to the Young Center. And by 2019, there's 162 districts and a population of 22,000. And then in New York, which is maybe the fastest growing outside of the big three, they had 30 districts in 1992 with 4,000 people. And then 2019, there's 155. So it went from 30 communities to 155 in the last, 20 so years. 28 years. And they have 21,000 or so people. So that means there are 5 times more Amish in New York and 3 times more Amish in Wisconsin than there were in the early 90s. And people are definitely starting to notice, like, if you're in New York and all of a sudden there's 5 times more Amish people, that's not something you're used to seeing. And obviously they're not, in the New York City area. They are mostly upstate New York. They're buying farmland that's been abandoned. That's also in Wisconsin what they do, dairy land. They're very smart buyers, so they do their research on land and they find this area of Wisconsin had a booming dairy industry. There's all these really nice farms, and then a lot of them are up for sale because they hit a bad year, and the Amish will just move in, buy all the land for cheaper, and settle in, and they're finding great land there because the farmland where they grew up in like Lancaster County and Holmes County, um, the land there is in such high demand because the Amish keep expanding into it. So they're really looking further and further out for this cheap land. In 2004, the Chicago Tribune wrote an article about how practical and savvy the Amish were and kind of spreading into these new areas. They looked at Wisconsin and they said the Amish, are generally experts at buying low and selling high. There's a calculated method to their moving, and it's rather well thought out. Before considering a region to move into, they send advanced teams to scout out the properties. They evaluate the quality of the soil, they gauge the receptiveness of the locals, and they calculate land prices. We liked what we saw, said Levi Fisher, 44, who first arrived on a scouting mission in southwestern Wisconsin in 1998 and put down less than $400,000 for his 218 acres a year later. And after their scouting missions, the area began to see a rapid influx of Amish, aided by weekly shuttle service to transport people and belongings from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin. So as the big three kind of see a population boom, the Amish are really looking to move further and further out. There's now North Carolina, where I live. They have more Amish coming in. I called the only Amish bishop I could get a hold of in North Carolina, and he said he could only talk briefly because he was leaving for Argentina, where, along with Bolivia, the Amish are beginning to plant settlements that far away. So they're really working on finding virgin territory, moving in there. They don't care about being far away from modern conveniences. They're going deep in the jungles in South America now, Amish as well as these conservative Mennonite groups. Like in Belize, there are very conservative Mennonite groups that are not too different than the Amish, and they're doing the same thing. But back here in the United States, places like Idaho, Arkansas, Colorado, Maine, Mississippi, Nebraska, South Dakota, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming all have had their first horse and buggies rolling into town because all those states I just named have had their first Amish settlement just in the 21st century, in the last 20 years. So there were no Amish in any of those states, and now there are. There's a lot of Amish in the surrounding states right around the big three, New York and Kentucky, Iowa, Wisconsin, the ones we named. And now those other ones I named, either even further out, they are starting to put down their roots and find places to settle in. So, for an example, Maine went from having 0 districts in 1992 to now they have 7 districts with 850 Amish in 2019. So these are areas that had never seen any, and they're now Amish have a foothold, and they're going to start doubling every 20 years as they have from kind of small numbers. But in some of these states where population is aging, and I mean, having a ton of kids in a thriving community means you're going to be the future of that area because there's not many other people filling in there, especially with, like I said, the population decline amongst your average American. There's nobody else who is kind of putting down community roots in a way that will be lasting like they are. So does this mean there's going to be a Amish takeover of the United States? It does sound far-fetched, and remember Lyman Stone predicted it would take 200 years. So, it would be very far away if it did happen. They would need to keep doubling over and over and over again, which they're doing, but just think about where we were 200 years ago. That was in the 1800s, and we were a fully founded country. And here we are 200 years later, descended just a few generations back from those people. So, really, in the big scheme of things, that's not a incredibly long time in the past. So maybe it is possible that you'll have, if these trends continue, Amish majority. But it is possible also that the trends won't continue. I mean, there could be a drop in birth rate among the Amish eventually. Maybe it just takes them longer to get to that point. Or we come to some really weird place deep in the future where there's like flying cars and missions to Mars, and there's everybody's living in a virtual reality type world, and then right, right outside the window there's people living a very different kind of game who are just farming and having Christian prayer meetings, and so I mean, it's, who knows? It's kind of a weird potential future, but I think the post-Christian enlightened West has sort of a bias of looking at history as this linear thing of progress where we're just going to go from religious morons into these really super scientific, intelligent societies that are really advanced and have figured everything out. I don't think that's inevitable. What it really is, it's, you look at who survives, who passes on their ideas best, who passes on their traditions and culture and to more people than somebody else, and that's really who's going to exist. So, if you have some very high tech, sophisticated society that doesn't have any kids, and very religious, conservative one that has a ton of kids, I mean, unless this high tech one can sort of pull a lot of the children out of the religious one, which is kind of what has happened a lot, in terms of Christianity plunging, and demographically, it's a lot of the children from religious families end up being in that secular Western mold eventually. But I think it could be harder to do that to the Amish. So I wouldn't say that people should, atheists should get their hopes up in that way. So I guess the question then is, how is this happening? Why is this happening? Why are the Amish doubling every 20 years while so many other demographics are plummeting? And really, the simple answer is babies and baptisms, or their fertility rate and their retention rate. And so for the fertility rate, we're talking about 2.2 around is good for replacing yourself. If you have really good health care, maybe 2.1 will do it. And then what a lot of the Western countries and developed nations have is maybe 1.5 or so children per woman. And the Amish have 7 to 8 children per woman, which is a rate that's seen in the only other places is Niger, which has the highest fertility rate in the world, is at 7. So they basically have the same fertility rate as the highest in the world, but Niger has a lot of war. They have like the Boko Haram, which is sort of an ISIS affiliate that constantly is causing havoc over there. They are very poor. They have bad health care. So the Amish are very peaceful. They don't lose any people in war. They also have the benefit of Western medicine. So they're actually able to grow faster even with that identical birth rate. And in America, they're going to stick out a lot because we have 1.8 or so children per woman. And for white Americans, it's like 1.82, and for Black Americans, 1.89. It's about the same for everybody, but it is below replacement. And for them, 7, they're going to just see that much faster growth. So another point is, you don't just need to bring children into the world, but you need to keep them part of your community. And the Amish are doing a really great job at that. Their retention rate is also off the charts. So we're looking at, like, in other videos I made, like the Catholic Church retaining like 30% of their youth, or, Episcopal and Presbyterian churches about the same, just like most of the youth just are shrugging off their parents' religion. Um, that's not the case with the Amish. You have 80 to 90% that stay within the community. So there's a lot of Amish communities where it's even higher than that. They're high 90s. But even just 90% is very impressive, especially if you're having 7 kids. So, they're pretty much all staying in the Amish community. A lot of that is, if you leave your community that you grew up in, you don't have your parents and your best friends and all of your siblings and everybody you grew up with, because it's such a close knit community. Leaving that community really puts you back a bit, makes you start over. And also the ones who stay, they're not really staying in some lukewarm, like a lot of people who remain Catholic, remain Episcopal, or any number of these churches in the United States. They're Catholic, they're Christian, they're whatever they are. They're still identifying with those faiths, but they're not really practicing them as much as their grandparents did, or even their parents did. Whereas these Amish people who grow up in the church and then they leave for a brief period and they come back and decide, I'm going to be in this religion, they're really very devoted people. They're not just putting half effort in. They're really, because you think about what they have to do. They have to not use electricity. They have to wear certain clothing. They have very strict rules on all kinds of things. So if you're going to do that, that kind of strict rule will make a person dedicate themselves more, to kind of justify it to themselves too. And they just also just have a deeper faith in a very tied-in community. They also have to practice something called the Ordnung, which I definitely want to get into in other videos, but it's a litany of rules that are very detailed, and if you don't practice them, you don't get to be part of the community. So they really have to dedicate themselves, and so they paid off. So they have really high birth rate and really high retention rate, and that's kind of what's done it. I guess you could ask, well, it's easy to say, if somebody asked, how do you get rich? And you say, well, you make a lot of money and you don't spend too much of it. That's kind of similar to say, well, how do you have population growth? You make a lot of babies and you don't lose a lot of them. You retain them all. It's sort of easier said than done. So then that brings up the question, well, how do you do that? How do you have families that produce that many children? How do you have that many youth that are enthusiastically staying within that community? And for that, I think, like I said, we'll talk about it in another video, but I do think that comes back to the Ordnung, which is their rules. That's something I think really keeps a community together. If you are on the same page, you know what you're supposed to do. It binds you together. And those rules are set so that we don't have kind of like American individualism, where we're all each going off and doing our own thing and nobody can judge me. I'm doing my own thing. That's not a good way to keep a family together, or definitely not a community. To just be a bunch of solo individuals doing their own thing. Having an Ordnung makes you feel like you're part of something, and makes you loyal to it, makes you belong in a way that binds a community together. And like I said, we'll talk about that in other videos, but for this video, I just wanted to bring it to people's attention that the Amish are doubling in size, and projections long term could mean that they're actually going to be a much bigger part of American life in the not too near future, and even bigger, maybe even a majority. Give it a couple 100 to 300 years. Who knows? I mean, there's possibilities that that their culture changes dramatically and they just kind of meld into the rest of us and are plugged into some VR systems in 300 years. Or, yeah, they could be the only ones having children, and them and groups similar to them that have decided to live by a code and have families and communities and faith. And so I think that's something for other Christians to take note of, is that is a recipe for success. You don't have to mimic them in all that they do, but the fact that they have a rule that they follow, that they have families and communities which they dedicate themselves to, and that I think is a successful recipe for a Christianity that can survive this modern individualist era. So that's all for this video, and hope to see you in the next one.